Hi everyone, it's Dave Musson here, at Dave Musson on Instagram, and I am so excited to welcome you to Season 2 of Constant Writers, the podcast where I talk to indie horror authors about them, about their work, and of course, about their relationship with Stephen King. So over the course of this series, and the previous series, if you haven't checked that out already, and I strongly suggest you do, you're going to meet a bunch of indie horror authors, and you're going to learn more about what motivates them, about their writing styles, about what sort of things they write about. And then we're going to geek out on Stephen King. And in each episode, each of my guests has nominated one Stephen King book in particular for us to take a bit of a deeper dive into. And then we wrap up with the 19-question quickfire Stephen King challenge. Now, I mentioned there is Season 1 already. Do check back through your feeds if you haven't listened to that. There's some great interviews there for you to be had. But we are here today to celebrate Season 2. The launch of Season 2, and I couldn't be happier with the first guest for this season. It is my friend Scott Woods, who is an acclaimed, award-winning poet. He's a columnist, an activist, an author, a podcaster, an artist, and a librarian as well. And he's a really, really nice guy. And he's very well known in the Stephen King space for his Stephen King and the Magical Negroes lecture, which I will link to in the description for this episode, and we will do talk about in this chat. So some things about Scott. You can check out some of his work. I've got his collection of poems, Urban Contemporary History Month, which you can pick up. And his book of choice for this episode is one that's quite heavily tied to his Magical Negroes lecture. It's kind of the inspiration for that lecture, really. It's The Green Mile. And what we go into, Scott talking about The Green Mile, is absolutely worth you listening or watching, depending whether you're joining me here on YouTube or you're joining me in your ears via whatever podcasting platform you listen to. So I think that is about it. There are things you can do to support me if you want to. In the description, you'll find links to sign up to my newsletter. You get a free ebook of some of my fiction for doing that, and you get weekly indie horror author recommendations and short stories from me. You can buy my quiz book, The Ultimate Stephen King Quiz Book, which is on my shelf behind me, and I totally forgot to pick it up for recording this first part. So, hey, that shows how good a salesman I am. And as I mentioned, you can follow me on Instagram and all of those kind of things. But really, I just want you to stick around and listen to Scott, because Scott knows where it's at. He is a great person to chat to. This is a chat that I've been planning for months and months. And it was actually the first time Scott and I got to talk to each other using our voices. Well, we've been friends via DM for a long time, but this was the first time we actually had a proper conversation. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. I'll be back on the other side just to basically say the same that I said here, but in less time. But otherwise, let's get into it. Season 2, Constant Writers, Episode 1, talking Magical Negroes, poetry, and The Green Mile. It's the fantastic Scott Woods. Scott, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to Constant Writers. How are you doing?
I am feeling awesome, and I am extremely honored to be here.
Well, I'm extremely honored to have you. It's as we were saying before we push record, you and I have talked a lot via DMs, but actually using our voices with each other, this is the first time. So it's a really, really good experience, and really great to have you on to chat about what we're going to chat about. I mean, we've got a lot to talk about, particularly when we go into Stephen King, but as you know from series 1 of this podcast, I want to start this chat with talking about you, and there's a lot to chat about with you. I mean, you know, you're a poet. I've literally got your book here, or one of your books. You're a columnist. You're a scholar of King and of Prince. You're an artist, an activist, podcaster, a busy man, and a lot of it connected to reading and writing. I mean, you're a librarian, of course, as well. So I guess, like, what's your origin story with all three things literature? Like, when did you fall in love with writing and reading, I guess?
Yeah, I've always been a reader from a very young age. Advanced, so I'm told. But, and I keep a shelf of books in my personal library that I refer to as my time machine shelf. And it's stuff I've tracked down over the years that I used to read as a kid. Most of the books I stole from an older brother who was into science fiction and whatnot. And half of the things on that shelf are pretty heady stuff, right? I would have been stealing those books around the age of 7 or so. And even the children's literature that I was reading was pretty dark. Lots of Roald Dahl, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So very young. very young. But I think my first experience with like language, besides using it, was actually Bill Cosby. Bill Cosby used to do these picture pages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Newspaper inserts, and it had an accompanying TV show. And he would go on there and do the activities in the paper, and you could do the activities at home with Bill Cosby on TV. And I would have been doing that when I was like 4, right? So thanks, Bill Cosby, I guess.
Look, good. And in terms of like, you've achieved a lot with your writing. Like, when did you start taking it more seriously? And like, what sort of things did you write first? Like, were you straight into poetry, or were you writing stories first, or were you writing columns as a child? Like, how did you get started?
So writing was the thing that I also did very early on, and that was initially stories, like short stories. This 3rd or 4th grade. I was a big fan of choose your own adventure books.
Yeah.
And so that was an easy hook. And it was like reading 5 adventures at once, right? So it was very inspiring to me. I don't think I got into poetry until I was a preteen.
Okay.
And heartache kind of became the order of the day, right? And so the cliche poet origin story, that was almost definitely 6th grade, right?
Yeah. And I can see the choose your own adventure thing. I mean, in this one, which I've been going through this week, most of the poems end with a, if you're this, go to page whatever. If you're this, go to page whatever. I like that as an extra bit of interactivity for the book. It's really nice.
Thank you.
I mean, poetry's an interesting one. I think you're the first poet I've had on this podcast. And I mean, I've mentioned to you before we started talking, I've long been fascinated with, but also I won't lie, quite intimidated by poetry. Like, I really like how it's connected to the spoken word, and I guess it's almost a spoken art form before it's a written one. But also, like, as someone who's not well versed in poetry, even just looking at a poem on a page and seeing, like, why are the line breaks there? Why is half of the poem aligned right? Why is half of it in italics? Whatever. Like, there are things that just throw me somewhat. So I guess take me inside the mind of a poet. Like, how do you write poetry, and how would it compare to writing, say, an article or a story?
So, well, let me first commend you on getting the history right. So for centuries, whatever we might call poetry was entirely oral until about 3000 BC, give or take, depending on where you are in the world, but basically 3000 BC. Anyhow, as to your question about composing poetry, it's pretty much the same for every poet. You see or experience something that activates you intellectually or emotionally, or you are struck with this great feeling, or you simply do what every other writer does and conceive of a story, and you simply use poetry tools to capture it instead of song or prose. There's nothing outstanding about the way that poetry happens except for your creative weapon of choice. And I would encourage you not to be intimidated by poetry because it's written by poets who generally are very soft people, right?
Yeah.
The less discussed question underneath the question is, why do people choose poetry to capture those things as opposed to other things? And that one usually comes down to the person. For me, I always wrote every kind of thing. So poetry was mostly a logic challenge, right? Can I do this thing? Can I capture it in poetry, right? Or is this something that needs to be something else? Turns out, compared to other types of writing, poetry is pretty easy to do poorly. And so few people care about poetry. So you can go a long way doing it poorly before anyone notices. Also, poets keep poetry mysterious on purpose, because if people realized how vast the poetic possibilities were, then everyone would do it and we'd lose our magic. So when you see poetry from like 100 years ago, you see a lot of technique. And when you see poetry from 10 years ago, you see a lot of storytelling and emotion, which is why it's such a popular expression on social media.
Yeah.
Most of that poetry is bad by traditional measures, but it's extremely effective as an emotional net, which is what people have always come to poetry for anyway. So in short, right, I choose the poetry tool out of the toolbox when the idea is hit. Sometimes that idea turns into a novel or a short story or an essay, but poetry is quick and fast, which is part, if not the bulk, of its appeal. Compared to other kinds of writing, you can get in and out of poetry pretty quick. You can write a poem today and have it published tomorrow. And considering most poets are very soft creatures who love validation, that's a win-win.
And how about you? Are you a technique poet, or are you a storytelling poet, or have you got a blend of the two? Like, would you put yourself in either camp?
I am almost entirely a storyteller.
Right.
I only use technique in aid of the story. I don't try to make the story apply to technique.
Yeah.
I've done it in the past. There are instances when, a technique, and when we say technique, we're talking about things like form. We're talking about, all of the tools that poets, traditionally use. For the most part, I just concern myself with, is this the story? Right.
Yeah.
And then I may have to, poeticize it a little, but I find my stuff, tends to go over with people because it's story.
Yeah. And that makes sense to me. I've been reading your book this week, and apologies, I can't remember the title of it off the top of the head, but there's a poem in here about going to see the NWA movie, and the last stanza, verse, section of that really made me sort of put the book down and just take a moment and think. And like that, I get your storytelling technique coming through there, because you kind of you built me, and you sort of took me down one road, built me up, and then like the last bit was just like boom, okay, here's the punchline almost. So yeah, I thought that was really powerful, and I get that, the sort of the storytelling element for sure. In terms of the we mentioned earlier the performance, like the actual oral element of poetry, I'm keen to hear a bit more about how important that is for you, because I know also in this answer I'd love you to tell me and the people watching and listening a bit more about your 24-hour solo poetry readings, because I'm really fascinated to hear more about that. But I'm guessing if you're putting yourself through the challenge of doing poetry for 24 hours and not repeating a poem, you must like performing these poems, I guess.
Sure. I love reading poetry publicly, right? It's a lot of fun. I come from a competitive poetry slam background. And so, the whole goal was engagement. And while I, for many years now, have not done that, you never lose those tools. And so it's great to get up in front of a room of people who maybe don't even know if they like poetry, and you make the sell, right? And if it's your work, great, even better, right? But the 24-hour readings are not all my poems, for the record, to be clear. I have a lot of poems, and I might have 24 hours worth of poems, but I did that like 8 years in a row with no repeats. And so for the most part, that was the work of other poets, which made that job easier, but there is no easy 24-hour performance anything.
No. And was the motivation of that purely the challenge of doing it, or were you fundraising? Was it where did it come from as an idea?
Yeah, that was entirely about the experience. I just wanted to see if it could be done. Well, first of all, I had to see if it had been done.
Yeah.
Technically, by Guinness World Book standards, it had not. They don't actually have a record for that. They have a record that's similar, but not really. And so once I determined that it was a thing that we could kind of put our finger down on and say, this has not been done before, that was the first appeal. And the second appeal was, how many poems would that, I love answering these artistic questions. How many poems would that take? How alive would you be by the end of it, And so I just grabbed like 100 poetry books or something, and all of my poems, and booked a room and just did it in the room. and people would come whenever they wanted to come and stay as long as they wanted to stay. And it got that first year was really dicey, right? Like I did it all wrong, right? Like I started at midnight and I was like, oh no, this is a mistake,
Mhm.
So, but it was a journey. And then every year I did it after that, it was about what else could I learn about myself as a poet, as a lover of poetry, as a presenter, as a performer. You'll learn a lot about yourself if you just do something for 24 hours.
Yeah. And I mean, you said one of the questions you asked yourself going into it was like, how would you be at the end of it? Like, how were you at the end of that first one?
Yeah, the first one I was completely destroyed. I think, again, did it all wrong. I think it was like, it was just wrong. I just did it wrong. And I didn't really figure out, how to work out the bathroom breaks or anything like that. I think I even ate ahead of time, which was also a mistake, right? So, because the act of it is very much like performing a fast. It's very ritualistic once you get into it.
Mm-hmm.
And your body is going to shut down at some point, like around, the first year, the timing was weird, but every year after that, I started it like in the evening or in the middle of the day or something. And so around 3 a.m., my body would start 2 a.m., my body would start rebelling,
Mm-hmm.
right? It was like, we must sleep and you're not going to let it. And so there would be these snatches of time where I would be dozing off in the middle of poems or whatever. But that first year, oh man, I thought I wouldn't have a voice. I did have a voice. It was just extremely deep for like 2 days. Like my throat was like raw, but not really raw. It was just really deep. And so that was kind of cool.
Yeah.
That was a nice takeaway for a couple of days. But no, I was completely wrecked.
And just lastly on poetry, I mean, I mentioned it's something that intimidates me. And I mean, this is going to sound, this is going to almost sound foreskin that I'm sitting here talking to you about. I have enjoyed reading your book. I was curious if you had any tips for someone like me who, I'm an avid reader and I read a loads of different things. For something like poetry that has never clicked, do you have any tips for what might unlock it for me? Is there somebody I should go to? Is it performance? Do I need to see a performance to make it click? Like what would your advice be?
My one tip for anybody is go to an open mic.
Mm-hmm.
And just watch poets who are writing right now, who are living right now, who are talking about the things that you talk about right now, and see how they're translating that through art, right? See how they're translating that through poetry. Now I'm going to tell you, it's an open mic. So at least half of it is going to be horrible, right? Yeah. But that is also important, right? It's important for you to see, okay, look, that is not good, or that is great. Or, you get a range. Hopefully you get a range. Mm-hmm. And that will compel you to at least understand what poetry is doing, right? Okay. Because on the page isn't really doing anything different than poetry on the stage in terms of its goals. And so I think if you just go to an open mic, and I wouldn't even really be too picky about the open mic, right? Not the best open mic, not the worst, who cares?
Yeah.
Just go, it's open. So it's always going to be up to whoever's in the room that night and see what happens.
Okay. Well, that actually leads me very nicely onto my last question before we switch to King. Was I wanted to hear a bit about Streetlight Guild, which you're very heavily involved in your hometown. And I know that is a space for art, a space for performance. So just tell me and those watching and listening a little bit more about that, because it's something that comes up. If people search for you, it does come up quite a lot. So I'm just curious to hear a bit more about it.
Sure. Streetlight Guild is a nonprofit organization that I created about 4 or 5 years ago now. And we do cultural programming here in my city of Columbus, Ohio. And my emphasis is on Columbus artists with a further emphasis on Black artists. And that's what we do. So I have 2 art galleries in the building. We do performances occasionally in the building. And about an hour or so from now, the building will open up and artists and writers will get to come in and just kind of create in the space for a few hours. We do that every Saturday. Mm-hmm. And And so, yeah, anything that I can kind of think of that would be kind of cool to help define Columbus culture is what that space is for specifically. Because Columbus is kind of, I don't want to say it's culture deficient, but it's identity deficient.
Right. Yeah.
And, it's like, well, if you tried to sit down and say, well, what's Columbus culture? It's like you would really struggle to define that. And I like cities where they have a character, they have identity, they have stories, they have legacy. And so I just kind of want to build that and help curate that in my city. That's what we do.
There must be an incredibly valuable space for those artists who come in. I mean, you must have a great sense of pride about that, being able to make it happen, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, and even the way that it happened was very fairy tale-ish, right? Like, we have a building; it's a beautiful space. We don't worry about the bills, right? We keep the money coming in, and that's awesome. But like, even just acquiring that space was kind of like a fairy tale. It just kind of came out of the blue, and so I just tell people that it was meant to be. Whatever that means to you, was meant to be.
Yeah. No, great. And I'll make sure I put some more information about that in the description so people can check it out if they want to find out more. So we are here, I guess, the reason we became friends and started talking was Stephen King, and this is a Stephen King channel. So let's get around to talking about him. And I think people listening and watching who might already be aware of your name will probably know about your connection to King in the form of your excellent lecture on Stephen King and Magical Negroes, and we will come to that in a moment. But I like to start this part of the interview with all of these just with the same question. So, like, what does Stephen King mean to you as a fan, and what sort of place does he hold in your heart?
Wow. So King is one of the most influential forces, not writers, forces in American culture, and has been for a greater portion of the last 50 years. And having been infected by his work at a very young age, I've basically grown up on his stories and wrestled with his worldview almost all of my life. And if you're American, Stephen King is in your DNA at this point. He is Americana.
Yeah.
Right? He defined what it meant to be scared in the 20th century. He's still trying to find ways to do that now. But he also wants that terror to be fun. Like, fun is a value for him as he creates. And he wants you to experience that fun. Well, he builds these roller coasters with words, and his books are written in a way that makes it all very fun. And that is, I wouldn't say that's uncommon with writers, but at the volume at which he produces, in the genre that he tends to lean into, like, it's really profound to find someone for whom horror is fun, right? And they want to translate that to you, and then it take, right? And for me, it just took, and all of the things that he was kind of talking about and trying to capture about the American experience, consciously or unconsciously, at various stages in his life, right? Because he's grown as a person, and conversely, his stories have seen the effect of that growth. Like, you're kind of growing up with him, and so in a way, he's kind of like a friend that you never really get to talk to, or he only calls you sometimes out of the blue, and then you just kind of wait for the next call.
And what about his impact on your writing? Like, how much has he impacted on your writing?
Stephen King is one of my greatest influences as a writer. Top 3 influence. Which is not to say I write like Stephen King or I write what Stephen King writes, because neither of those things is true.
Yeah.
His greatest gift to writers like me is that he makes certain things okay to do as a writer. So the granular, busybody first person is okay if you can pull it off, right? Some of his stories are very poetic in the sense that he's great at taking a small moment and excavating it and pulling a book out of it, right? Or a story out of it. So for me, King has been a great teacher. I was not in college long enough to study writing. I failed college almost immediately and miserably. And so I didn't really get to study writing. All of that is self-taught.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how much you know about the American public school system, but it isn't great, right? And so if you walk away from public education with a love for literature, you got luck. You maybe caught some great teachers or librarians along the way. So King was effectively my college. He was how I learned what I wanted to do as a writer and what I didn't want to do as a writer.
Okay. Yeah. Seems like a pretty good teacher. Seems like you've done pretty well out of it. So let's go on to your lecture that I mentioned. So King and the Magical Negro. So I read about this for a while and finally got to see you deliver it in 2022 and thought it was absolutely excellent. I imagine we're likely to start crossing over with your book of choice for this chat, which is The Green Mile. So I guess without going in too much on that particular title, but I do want to spend a bit of time chatting about the lecture. And to start with, can you just talk a bit about how the lecture first came into being?
Sure. I was reading The Green Mile in 1996. And without getting too much into that yet, I will say that at the time, I was like near my peak as a Black queer activist.
Mm-hmm.
So I was, at protests or whatever rallies, I was doing programming, I was teaching kids, I was in the community doing all this work. And everything at that time for me in my life was very Black power.
Yeah.
And then The Green Mile came out. And now, mind you, I'm a lifelong Stephen King fan. And so really, The Green Mile hit me at what may be like the most compelling part of my experience as a Black person, right? Like that book and my self-awareness were like colliding trains.
Yeah.
So, and that's when I started to realize it was a problem, but it didn't really sink in. I didn't know what to do with that relationship until, several years ago when, I was really just trying to think about what this relationship was and really started to dig into it. And then I said, I think there's a presentation here. I don't know if it's an essay or whatever, and so the first time that I approached this question and material was as an essay. I was invited to write an essay for a now defunct magazine, Union Station magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote the first version of what would become the Magical Negro eventually the lecture.
Yeah.
The essay kind of just swam out in the world for a little while. And then at some point I decided to start trying to make lectures out of it.
Well, great. And in terms of, for anyone watching or listening who might not be familiar with the term Magical Negro, I guess it'd be useful to have you define it and maybe, if possible at all, if you can find maybe one example in King's work, just to give people a bit of an illustration, that might be helpful.
Let me see if I can try. A Magical Negro is a narrative trope, and it utilizes stereotypical characters of color, usually Black, but not always, and which is not even true in Stephen King's work, right? Whose sole purpose is to prop up white main characters while being stripped of dignity, interiority, purpose, beyond being in service of the main character. The magic part is optional. It's the sacrifice that really sets these characters apart. Sometimes that sacrifice is literal. Usually that sacrifice is at least like a sacrifice of your character, your dignity, your backstory, whatever your goals in life might be. The magic part makes it sound like that's always like somebody imbued with magical powers. That's not exactly what that means. That's kind of a play on how the character is kind of enacted in the story or in a movie or in a show.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of those, yeah, like I guess the obvious example from King would be the book we're going to talk about in a bit, being The Green Mile, I guess.
Yeah, though he has many, obviously, right?
Yeah, clearly.
The I guess you did ask for an example. Let's just pick one from what is, perhaps, I think probably I don't know if it's his best novel, but it's probably his greatest novel, the one with the greatest effect, right? The Stand. Mother Abigail is, totally 100% this trope, this magical Negro trope that we're talking about, which is, it almost, in a sense, the way she is introduced almost circumvents that definition a little bit, right? That's the thing about this definition that makes it so touchy, is because some elements are always present, some elements are not, but the result is the same.
Yeah.
In her case, normally a character like her would not have all the backstory, the pages and pages of backstory that Mother Abigail has. So she has a lot of interiority for a magical Negro. But her actions are 110% in line.
Yeah. Now, I know you say in the lecture that the purpose of this lecture is not you being out there trying to accuse Stephen King of being a racist, and by all accounts, he seems like a pretty decent human being. But the way he writes his black characters and has done consistently for decades, I guess at best feels misguided and outdated. I mean, for you, what do you see as his most problematic tropes that continue to crop up? Because he has acknowledged that in interviews for a long time that he gets this wrong, but you're not sure of material in your lecture to pull examples. So what are those things that keep coming up time and time again that are problematic for you?
For his black characters specifically, it is almost the most common problem is in their descriptions, right? Whether that's an omniscient narrator or whether that's a character perspective, it's almost entirely consistently the way that they are introduced, right? So the way that they are described, their physicality, the depth of their blackness, several references to being black as coal and this kind of thing. Like no one is ever just an African American in a Stephen King novel, right? They are like black as coal, black as night, menstrual black, right? These kinds of things. Those are basically quotes, right? So
yeah.
So that's the most common one, is in their introduction, the way that they're described. Probably the second most common one is that they are berated racially. They are being called N-words, they are being described and talked to and dealt with in ways that, are exceedingly racist. And while I get that King wants to make certain characters very villainous and that racism is an easy way to go, it is not a device without consequence, right? That has an effect. That has an effect on me as a black reader, but it has an effect on his largely white audience, his predominantly white audience. I don't know that most white people picking up a King book, and this will be true for most white people in general, like I don't know that they spend a lot of time discerning when instances like that are entertainment or supposed to be more symbolic or representative of reality, or if it's even a problem. Lots of racists read King, right? So to me, it's like, yo, maybe we just don't need to hit that button so much,
Yeah.
So those are the top two ways that, those black characters kind of get dealt with in King out the gate. And then after that, it's just a laundry list based on what other type of character they are.
Yeah. And again, this might be a difficult question for you to answer, but if you could imagine yourself in a world where you didn't know as much as you do about King and his character and his politics, if you were going purely based on the words that he's committed to page, does his writing come across like the writing of a racist person?
Not generally, but that's only because black characters appear so infrequently in his work.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
If he had a black character in every book, I think it would be way more obvious. But he'll go, entire books without black characters at all.
Yeah.
If I read his work, Sans Politique, right, I think he was a raging sexist, but I would, but I would take some digging before the racist button got hit.
Okay. So I guess I was curious, like going back to the examples of, I think I put in my question, I think I asked if you had a favorite example of this sort of problematic element of his work. Favorite's probably not the right word, but if I say that my next question is going to be, do you have any examples of when he's written a black character well? So let's take the flip of that. Like what are you, we talked about Mother Abigail. We're going to talk about John Coffey in a bit. Like, are there any other standout ones that like when you're going through them in your lecture, you're almost too embarrassed to go through them? They're so cringeworthy or problematic or painful or anything. Like which ones would stand out?
Well, so Mother Abigail, in the same book, right? So The Stand, the revised edition, which is the only edition you can get anymore. The early on, there's a scene, the Black Junta scene, right? Like that's like grossly like, I don't like to use the word problematic because it's very vague. It's grossly racist, right? And like, if you just had to like make a checklist of all of these stereotypes of Black people, like 8 out of 10 of them would be in that one scene, in those like 3 or 4 pages.
Mm-hmm.
That's like the most like probably gross scene that I can point to and say, wow, that is rampagingly racist, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's a pretty bad one.
I remember the one that you really opened my eyes to was, forget if it's Finders Keepers or End of Watch, but the Lowtown, was it Lowtown scene in End of Watch?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean that one, like, I mean, I guess easier for me as a white male reader to not really have it hit me for the first time reading it, but then watching you read it and seeing your face when you're reading it, it's like, no, actually, this is really bad, isn't it? I mean, it's one thing that that scene is there, but for that to be in a book that came out in 2016, like, it's frustrating, right? That it's still happening.
Yeah, and that's King trying, right?
Yeah.
Like trying to get it kind of right, but you can tell like he doesn't really talk to a lot of Black people, and he probably gets a lot of Black culture through media.
Mm-hmm.
All of that is very apparent in that passage of pages, and it's like, oh man, he really thinks he's helping here a little bit. Like he's addressing classism and he's addressing colorism, right? Oh my, colorism. Stephen King on colorism, right? Mm-hmm. Like, oh my God. And then the description of the neighborhood, all of that. But I mean, the thing that usually sends people off the rails when I do this in the lectures is the hacky sack mention. Like that usually puts us all on the floor. Like I have never seen it ever, anywhere, at any time in my entire Black life, any 2 or more Black people playing hacky sack. I have never, ever, I've never even seen that depicted in a movie. So for him to put that in the book, I was just like, this is laugh out loud. I think I threw the book down when I read that. Like I was laughing so hard. But it's like, and I tried to place that in the lecture at a place where, near the end where we kind of need that levity at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the only time I've ever seen hacky sack was a bunch of white guys in metal bands doing it on a behind the scenes DVD in between sets because they're so bored out of their mind. So yeah, crazy. So I mentioned I wanted to hear if you had any examples of when he has actually done this well. And I remember from the lecture there were a couple where it was like, oh, okay, there are some here that we have to dig to. Off the top of your head, are there any that you would throw out there as King getting it right?
Yeah. It's important to, I think, keep an example in the pocket, right?
Yeah.
Mike Hanlon in it.
Mm-hmm.
I think King got Mike Hanlon right. Mike Hanlon had interiority, he had culture, he had intellect and skills, he was a person, he had a family and a history, and he was able to communicate emotionally. And even when King felt the need to bring racism into Mike's story, he did it in a way that was real to Mike and not pedestrian to King. And that's really important. That's a very important distinction to make, because King usually drops that ball, right? He usually brings that racism, I think, in a way that he perceives is like, let me be evil Stephen King here and say all these horrible things, right? Let me find the worst version of myself and then say those things and write those things. And then even when it, on the surface, it seems as if that's what's happening, narratively, it's not. Like, it's really in service to Mike and describing why Mike is the way he is, and it doesn't just generate trauma in Mike. It generates purpose and mission in Mike, right? I thought that was great. And Mike is clearly Black, right? So yeah. Those are all very, hard lines to kind of, walk down. But I think King nailed it in it. The book may have other issues, but Mike is not one of them.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'm conscious about asking this next question, but mainly because I don't want it to feel like the thing of a white guy asking their Black friend to be Google and do the work for them. But I'm always I'm interested to hear what you hope people get from the lecture and what they do with it afterwards. But particularly white readers of King's work, like what do you hope they go off and maybe change or get from your lecture once they've watched it?
So first of all, I just want to go on record that we're now friends, by your own admission.
Good, I'm glad.
But everything starts with a vision, right? And in this world, every action we take starts with a thought. And so I want to put a lens on that vision that enables people to be more cognizant of the other people around them and what they're going through. I want everyone to think more critically about everything. I hope that people leave it wanting to literally change the world around them, right? Which is how you change the world, right? You don't go out and then change the world. You change the world around you, and then hopefully the next person does the same and the same. And so you have this chain of change. You hope that's how that happens. And so I just want people to change the world where they are and to challenge themselves and literature to be better and to understand the power that stories have on how the world manifests, right? Like, we don't have countries without vision.
Yeah.
Somebody wanted there to be a country, and then they did X, Y, and Z to make that happen. And so my goal is like, well, let's put a lens on the vision. Let us make the vision as critical as we can make it before we start, leveling things and people.
And if you got the chance to sit down and chat to King himself about this, what would you say? What would you want to get from that chat?
I'd really want to dig into how much of this he is aware of.
Yeah.
And why it persists in his writing. If he's not aware of how it comes off, then I'd love to convey that to him. If he does know, and it's an issue, and he thinks what he's doing is the way to tackle that, I'd love to have that argument.
Yeah.
But in a very friendly, respectful way, of course, preferably, over a plate of barbecue or something. But yeah, I would really want to come down on a definitive reason.
Yeah.
A reason, right? Because him acknowledging that it's a problem is not enough, apparently. Right?
Yeah.
So I'd really want to interrogate that.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you'll get the chance one day. You never know.
I don't know if I'd go looking for that discussion, but
Yeah. Well, you never know where he might be watching. He might give you a call one day. Well, let's let's sort of get into the final part of this and jump into your book of choice. So in these interviews, I ask all of my guests to pick a King book to take us a bit of a deeper dive into. And we've already mentioned it's The Green Mile. This is related to your lecture. I've got part one of the serialized version here, and all on my shelves behind me from 1996. I remember when we were arranging this chat, you said it could be fun to unpack this one again. Now you've done your lecture for a few years, and I guess you've just had the world in general just happening for the last few years. So tell me, like, the Green Mile, as we sit here and record this in 2023, like, how do you feel about this book?
So, I mean, since we're friends, like, I have always liked this book, this story, even while it contains what it contains. It's just such a powerful example of what makes King work, especially in the serialized format, right? Like, if he had just sat down and wrote a novel straight, I think it would have been different, but a little different. But, you know, watching him kind of unpack this story serialized, to me, is like amazing. That's an amazing gift to be able to do that. To know when to pull the punch and what to allude to, what not to allude to, like that. That's just genius. The format of it is genius, and putting it all together in, you know, one book form, so to speak. You know, it all works and it all locks, and it's just a powerfully well told story. And so, yes, I still love this book.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. I mean, I normally ask my guests about characters, and there's probably only one character we can start with on here. It's John Coffey, not like the drink. Again, thoughts, John Coffey.
Yeah, so John Coffey is a hyper racist concoction of what a black man is, right? So to be blunt,
yeah,
he's the only black male character in the story, and conversely, he stands in for all black men to readers. And as I kept reading through the story, that kept drilling into me, right? At the same time, John Coffey is very compelling. Like the epitome of mystery, right? We know nothing about John Coffey except what we observe in those moments, which are, you know, scattered throughout, but still pretty sparse, right? We don't know anything about him except what he can do. And that is his, as a character, that is his blessing to the reader, and that is his curse to the reader, right? So, but he's an extremely racist character, right? Like, you know, there's no getting around that.
I know Grady Hendrickson, he did his King reread in 2015, and I've got the quote here that he said about John Coffey. He said, specifically about Coffey, spoiler alert, dying, but he said, Coffey's death doesn't save the souls of the white people around him. It damns them. And I think he was linking that to the idea of whether or not John Coffey is a magical Negro. Like, how do you react to that as a quote from Hendricks?
I mean, I would push back on it a little bit, but I don't entirely disagree. I certainly would want to access the context of arriving to that conclusion, but, you know, it's interesting. Hendricks isn't wrong in the respect that Coffey's death doesn't save the souls of the white people around him. But, you know, there is the obvious, there is the fact, quote unquote, the fact that these people get to go on with their lives.
Yeah.
And while they may be a little traumatized or maybe even scarred by, you know, having, you know, killed John Coffey, knowing that he's innocent, knowing that he's powerful, knowing that he perhaps had something to give the world, that they get to go on with their lives. And I think that Hendricks' suggestion that it damns them, that might be a little generous.
Yeah.
You know, I think if it's like how these things play out in the real world, white people are perfectly okay with that after a time. Right? So, you know, they get to move on.
Yeah.
They get to kind of close the door on that chapter of their lives anytime racism is kind of concerned.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's not wrong. I I just wouldn't come down on it 100%.
Uh-huh. So thinking in terms of the other characters in this book, the other guys who spend time on death row there in that cell block, like who else jumps off the page to you as being particularly interesting, engaging, whatever characters? Who are your favorites?
Paul Edgecombe. He has to be a top 3 first-person narrator in King book, right? Like, you really kind of want to hear him talk about anything. King really nails him down. He nails down Paul in a way that he doesn't do very frequently with his first-person narrators, where he gives us too much, right? Like, we're getting like, oh, my toenail hurts, kind of levels of insight on first person. And Paul is not like that. Paul is, I have a story to tell. I'm here to tell the story. Boom, boom, boom. King does this. I mean, it's not the first time, the only time. It's definitely one of the top 3 times. I thought, is it CT's Theory of Pets, I think is the name of the story. I mean, a narrator on top of a narrator, that's just awesome. Mm-hmm. But Paul is like, he's an incredible, and I think that the serialization of the story probably helps shave off some of that, right? Some of that really granular type of stuff. So yeah, definitely Paul. And I think that the way that Paul interacts with Coffee is really, it's true to the character, right? Yeah. It's not all the things that I wish a character would have done, but I didn't write the story.
Yeah. You've mentioned the serialization a couple of times and how it works. Like, you were reading this when it came out, right? So like, how was that as an experience to have to get a bit and then wait a month and get a bit more? Because I keep imagining, like, whenever a Green Mile anniversary comes along, I'll post something on social media and I'll be like, I'll always ask the question, like, would you like to see King do this again? Do you think it'd be fun? And I'm always torn as to whether it would be fun or whether it'd be agony. Like, how was it when this was coming out month to month?
It was fun. Yeah. Well, yeah, definitely a touch of agony, right? Like, because, I was rushing out to like a grocery store because they were selling them in grocery stores.
Yeah.
It was so popular, right? So I would just rush out to the grocery store and grab the next month's, right? So it was cool to experience that, like, to have to wait for the story month to month. That was really amazing to me. And I think that was a real gift to readers and to literature that King did that. The King of all people would say, no, we can do this. We can bring this back. This is something, this is something cool, like listening to the radio in real time, not streaming everything or whatever, like it's, it was a lot of fun. Even as I struggled with the story, it was a lot of fun because I kept waiting to see what he was going to do. Like, is he not going to do with Coffee what I think he's going to do with Coffee? As a character, not the resolution, as a character. Yeah. Right? I'm like, I think Stephen King just introduced a really problematic character. I think this is going to pay out, and so that was an amazing thing. And I think I read the whole book together once after that, after 96. At some point in the past, I reread it, as a one sit kind of thing. And I mean, it was still the story. It was still great, Yeah. But it was definitely missing the tension. Right.
Do you think that exercise in patience that this was for readers, for King fans, I get the sense that personally, I think I'd like to give it a try as experiencing it now, but I think the wider world just wouldn't have the patience to deal with that. The way, we're in such a distracting environment now compared to 1996. I wonder whether he's not done it again because it just wouldn't work these days. What do you think? Do you think there's still a patience for this kind of thing?
I don't know. I think the world doesn't know what it needs until it gets it. Right? I don't know that we knew that we needed the Green Mile until we got it that way, right?
Yeah.
And so I tend to not worry about what the world thinks in those terms, right? Because most people don't know what they want. And so it's up to us as artists, as creators, as curators, as reviewers. And hey, I say gatekeepers on some level. It's important that we really not worry about what they think they want, right? Because everything that they, everyone we call a genius now was, not a genius when they came out.
Yeah.
And so it's important for us to kind of, when we see it, when we can put our eye on genius and talent and things that people can use in their lives, it's important for us to not worry about whether or not they know it or they think it. And so I think King could do it again. But I think it would take someone of King's stature to make it work. Right? It would have to be somebody pretty big and that people already kind of are into on that level.
Yeah. I mean, there's not going to be any point in me making a serialized novel because very few people would care. But yeah, I get that. Yeah,
I feel your pain.
I mean, we've talked character, we've talked about the format. Like in terms of scenes, in terms of just shit that happens in this story, like what are your standout moments in the Green Mile?
Well, I think I will tell you, like, when they throw Percy into the soft padded road, I just thought I really hate the character, right? And so any bad thing that happens to him, I took great joy and delight in. And so I think there was something about that scene, man. It really stuck with me. I think just because he got his comeuppance, I think, is how that played out. And the way that they played that in the movie, I thought was just excellent.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to mention the movie. Can't really talk about the Green Mile and not mention it because it's such a staggering achievement in cinema. Like for something that lengthy and that critically acclaimed. Like, are you a fan of the movie as well as the book?
I mean, don't tell Spike Lee, but yeah, I'm a fan of the movie. Yeah, I mean, whenever I'm kind of blasting through the television channels, if it's on, I will stop for at least a few minutes to see what's happening. Yeah.
It definitely has that. It has something about it for sure. So I guess we're pretty much done on the Green Mile now. But I guess to wrap off, this is a question I always ask my guests for all of their books. If somebody watching or listening to this hadn't given the Green Mile a go yet and needed a bit of convincing, what 3 words would you use to sum up the Green Mile for someone who's not gone in on it yet?
Death row magic.
Like it. That's good.
This is ultimately a prison story, right? So
yeah, great. Okay, nice. Well, Scott, we are almost done. And it's been a great chat, and it's, like I said at the start, it's so good to actually talk to you and not just DM you all the time. So this has been a real pleasure. But before I let you go, and this isn't optional, this is just like, this is happening, so are you ready to do it, basically? But it's time for you to go through the quickfire 19 question King challenge. So like I said, we're doing it. Just wanted to check, like, are you ready to go?
Sure.
Good. So, I mean, you'll know from listening to season 1, it's the same 19 questions that all of my guests get asked, and it's essentially a quickfire round. You don't need to explain anything. I might ask you for explanation if something completely throws me, but otherwise, let's just power through it. So, let's get into it. What was your first King book that you ever read?
Firestarter.
And what's the most recent one you've read?
Gwendy's Final Task.
Mm-hmm. What's your all-time favorite King book?
Dead Zone.
Yes, great choice. And what about your all-time least favorite?
Oh man. There's so many. I'm gonna go with Eyes of the Dragon. I'm not a fan.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. What do you think is King's most underrated book?
Today, my answer is The Dark Half.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't get enough love.
Okay. Changing that in this season. I will give you a sneak preview. Which King book has your favourite cover artwork?
I think I gotta go with The Stand. It's an iconic cover, right?
The one with the Jedi and
Yeah,
the plague.
like it's completely not the story, but it's how it is. Right?
Okay. And what about your least favorite cover art?
Insomnia. That's it looks like what it describes.
The original, the red and white one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What's the one King book that you could recommend to any type of reader?
So I usually just say I usually have to get two answers.
Okay.
Do you like short stories or do you like novels? And so for novels, it's The Dead Zone, and for short stories, it's Night Shift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great examples. In terms of adaptations, movies, TV series, whatever, what's your favorite King adaptation?
Shawshank Redemption.
Uh-huh. And what about yours?
Perfect.
Yeah, hard to argue with that. And what about your least favorite?
Man. Maximum Overdrive.
Okay. Yeah.
The waste of a great story.
Yeah, well, that's cocaine for you. Which if you could have a King character make a cameo in your own writing, who would you like to have?
I would love to take a swipe at Dick Halloran.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Okay. I don't know, you mentioned earlier that you don't necessarily write like Stephen King, but if I forced you to pick a King book or story that is most similar to your style of writing, what would you throw back at me?
Oh, it's got to be. Oh man. Oh, here's an interesting choice. Go with. No. Yeah. Let's say The Running Man.
Okay.
It's got a beat and rhythm to it that I like and that I think that I'm doing.
Yeah. Okay. No, cool. And for this question, I just want you to give me one King book for each of these. So one King book that you would keep forever, reread as many times as you like, just love forever and ever. One that you read only once and then just put on your shelf and just never really pick up again. And one that you would happily delete from existence.
So the Keep Forever book is I'm gonna try to stop saying The Dead Zone every day.
I don't mind.
So I think the Keep Forever book I'm gonna say is gonna be It.
Mm-hmm.
The Read Only Once book is probably got to be the Read Only Once. I'm gonna say Revival.
Okay.
It's a good book. You only need it once though.
Mm-hmm.
And the Delete from Existence. Let's see, Story.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not. Oh my God, I'm not a fan.
Okay, and then for the final 5 of this challenge, it's just a straight either or. Again, no explanation needed. We'll just rattle through these. So, do you prefer the book or the movie?
The book.
The Stand or It?
It.
Would you rather a holiday in Derry or a night at the Overlook?
Holiday in Derry, even though they abhor black people.
I was going to say that is a bold move. I mean, that's like the. Forgive me if this sounds awful. That in my head, that is like the inverse at the start of Die Hard 3, almost. Like, I don't know. Anyway, I'm distracting myself here. Short story or full novel?
It used to be a short story. Now it's full novel.
Okay. And lastly, go on.
I was just going to say King, like when King started doing short stories, like his first handful of collections were like indestructible, just incredible ideas. But in my opinion, his short stories have kind of lost their luster in more recent collections.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. And lastly, would you rather go for walkies with Cujo or have a weekend with Annie Wilkes?
Gotta go with Cujo. Gotta go with
Yeah.
Cujo.
He's a good
He's
boy,
like
right?
run.
Yeah, and he's a good boy at heart. It's not his fault. This is what I say to everybody on this question. Again, rambling now. Scott, thank you so much for your time. This has been really good to chat and go through all of these things. Before we wrap this up, I just wanted to throw it over to you to basically just plug what you've got on. So where can people find you? Where can they find your work? What should they be looking at? What have you got coming up? The floor is yours, my friend.
So I, as a writer, you can find some of my stuff online at scottwoodswrites.net. I have 3 books, 2 books of poetry and 1 book of essays about Prince. You can find all of those on Amazon. And I'm supposed to be finishing up at least 1 book this year, so fingers crossed on that. And then the work that I do with Streetlight Guild is just streetlightguild.org. While that has a very local focus, a lot of people outside of my city follow it and pay attention to it because we do lots of cool things, and sometimes it's inspiring.
And I'd also throw in your podcast, Race Against the Machine. I've really been enjoying that. Definitely, I'll put links to that in the description. And in terms of your socials, what handles have you got? What do people need to search for to find you?
So I'm on Facebook. It's pretty clear that it's me. Just look for the Doctor Who scarf.
Yeah.
On Twitter, it's Scott Woods Says. And on Instagram, it's Scott Woods Rolls.
Okay. Great. Well, there we go. And I'll make sure links to all of those are in the description. But yeah, we've made it. We're done. So Scott, again, thank you so much. It's been so good to chat, and it's genuinely a real honor and a thrill to have you on this season. I know I reached out to you when I first had the idea of the podcast, and we couldn't get it done in time for season 1, but couldn't think of a better guest to have on season 2. So thank you so much for giving up your time and being so generous. And yeah, it's just been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. I'm a huge fan, so keep up the good work.
Oh, well, same to you, my friend, and we'll speak soon.
There we go. What a great way to kick off season 2 of Constant Writers. Thank you so much to Scott for his time and his wisdom and his energy and his support of the podcast and all of those other things as well. You can return the favor by checking out Scott's work. His collection of poetry is great, even for somebody like me who struggles with poetry. As I talked about in the conversation, I got a lot out of this. Check out his writing online. I'll make sure that there's links to everything in the descriptions. Check him out on Twitter and Instagram. He's a great follow. And hey, let me know in the comments what you think about what we discussed, particularly about what we talked about with Magical Negroes, the Green Mile, all of that kind of stuff. And of course, if you want to check out Scott's lecture on the Magical Negroes, which you absolutely should, and don't be put off by the fact that it's 2 hours long. It's one of the best 2 hours you will ever invest in yourself and your growth as a reader. Take the time to watch it. It's linked in the description. If you're listening to the audio version of this, do check out the description. It's on YouTube. Absolutely check it out. It will change your perspective, not just on Stephen King, but on literature in general, particularly if, like me, you're a white guy who has kind of cruised through life based on just privileges that you've just been handed to you, and you've never been forced to challenge yourself or think differently about things. Watch Scott's lecture. It really does change how you will approach a lot of things in life. Anyway, got a bit deep for the ending there, but it's important stuff. So thank you so much for joining me on season 2 of Constant Writers. Do share this episode with a friend if you think they'd like it. Check out season 1, and of course, come back next week, because we're going to be discussing The Dark Half with my friend and yours, Mr. Garth Jones. Until then, take care, and I'll be back with another Constant Writer very soon.